Israel unlawfully killed a number of Palestinians in drone attacks during its war on Gaza, says a new report by Human Rights Watch. Israel insists it was only countering Hamas rockets. Just who is to blame? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Nick Clark. Welcome to the programme. Intentional or accidental? Innocent Palestinian civilians killed by Israeli spy drones, so finds a new report from Human Rights Watch. In December last year, Israel launched a 3-week offensive, killing as many as 1,400 Palestinians. Now it's claimed some civilians were killed by the unmanned planes, despite their so-called precision accuracy and high-tech surveillance techniques. As Shireen Tadros now reports from Gaza, it said drone operators failed to exercise proper caution, as required by the laws of war, in verifying the identity of their targets.
For 40 years, Abu Ahmed has been making antiques. It's a family business he built from scratch. But during the war on Gaza, Israel claimed this was a rocket-making workshop and bombarded the area. As Abu Ahmed's relatives rushed to move equipment, including oxygen canisters they used to mold metal, to safety, an Israeli drone fired a missile, killing his son and 8 others. Israel later admitted the canisters were mistaken for rockets and civilians were killed, but they insist there were Hamas fighters nearby.
If we were moving rockets, we wouldn't have done it in an open back truck where they would be exposed. If they were really Grad-type rockets, the whole neighborhood would have gone up in smokes when Israel hit us.
Abu Ahmed's is one of 6 families mentioned in a report by Human Rights Watch on Israel's misuse of drones to kill civilians in Gaza. According to the study called Precisely Wrong, half of Israel's drone attacks during the war killed innocent people, including children playing on rooftops. Images like this one of the attack that killed Abu Ahmed's son show how unmanned aerial vehicles or drones have advanced sensors and infrared cameras attached to the precision-guided missiles. The report argues this video raises serious doubts that the oxygen canisters constituted a military target, so the army should have held fire. Drones are one of the most precise weapons in Israel's arsenal.
This is just one example of an attack by an Israeli drone. According to the report, drone operators can clearly see their targets and can divert their missiles even after the missile's been launched. So given these capabilities, why is it that so many innocent people were killed?
A question Human Rights Watch has been asking Israel to respond to for months.
So the drones are only as effective in minimizing civilian harm as the care that's taken by the person who is operating it. And the problem is we found time and again that the Israeli operators of drones were not taking the proper care, and in fact were violating the Geneva Conventions.
Human Rights Watch says 29 civilians, 8 of those children, were killed by Israeli drones during the war. Abu Ahmed doesn't believe he'll ever get an answer to why his son was killed in a war that was meant, says Israel, to be against Gaza's fighters and not its people. Shireen Tadros, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
Well, it's a contentious issue, no doubt at all about that. Joining us today to take it on are our guests in Jerusalem, Mark REGEV, spokesman for the Israeli government. In Ramallah, Mustafa al-barghouti, the president of the Palestinian National Initiative. And finally, also in Jerusalem, Bill van ESVELD, who's a senior researcher for Human Rights Watch in North Africa and the Middle East. Welcome, gentlemen, to you all. Thanks for your time. Mr. van ESVELD, first of all, could you briefly, if you will, lay out the parameters of this? Just give us an idea of the time and resources that went into compiling this report and how you can be so certain of the facts, bearing in mind they'll differ from the Israeli view.
Of course. A team of 5 Human Rights Watch researchers went into Gaza through Rafah, the Egyptian crossing, immediately after the unilateral ceasefires declared by both sides on January 18th. We were able to stay for 2 weeks before the Egyptian authorities requested us to leave. And all 5 of us went around and conducted on-site investigations into these attacks. We used multiple sources for reaching our conclusions. The most important was forensic ballistic evidence. Each of the missile strike sites presented very, very strongly similar evidence, such as hundreds of tiny cubic pieces of tungsten, a very dense metal, that you only find in certain types of drone-fired missiles, parts of the missile's guidance systems, circuit boards, bits of the body of the missile, things like that. Of course, we talked to witnesses and victims, and we also carefully plotted where the attacks occurred on satellite imagery. And based on all of these things, plus careful research into media accounts of where the IDF was, talking to witnesses about whether they heard drones overhead at the time, that's the way we reached our conclusions.
Okay, well, so
and let me just say,
yeah, I just wanted to say, you detailed 6 particular incidents in which civilians were killed. How do we know that the rockets in question were fired from drones, from these spy planes?
Right. Well, because there are 2 kinds of rockets that can be fired from drones, from Israeli drones. There's the Israeli-produced Spike missile, and there's the American-produced modified Hellfire 2 missile. The normal Hellfire is an anti-tank missile that is fired from a helicopter, but that is not the kind of forensic evidence that we found at these sites. The evidence that we found was very consistent, very clear, and it would only come from one of these types of drone-fired missiles.
And how did the Israeli army help with your research for this report?
Well, unfortunately, we've had no cooperation from the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. We submitted detailed questions about all 6 cases, including GPS satellite coordinates of where they happened, times and dates, months ago, on March 12th, and we received no response to those questions. We've been trying to set up a meeting ever since, and we have not been granted a meeting. So it's very unfortunate. We've received no cooperation.
Mustafa al-barghouti in Ramallah, your view, please, of this report?
I didn't get your question, please. Can you repeat that?
We're just keen to hear what your view of this report is.
Well, in my opinion, this report is a confirmation of what we have not only suspected, but witnessed and investigated during the last few months. Israel has committed 7 war crimes in Gaza, including disproportionate use of force, including attacks on civilians, including attacking and killing civilians, including prevention of provision of medical care to injured people, attacking medical personnel, which led to the death of 16 of of doctors and nurses. And in addition to that, total destruction or severe destruction of infrastructure for with no reason, and the illegal use of illegal weapons like white phosphorus. These are 7 confirmed war crimes that many courts in the world are looking into today. And in my opinion, Israel knows very well that it has committed these crimes, and that's why it tried everything it could to establish a blackout on what was going during the war in Gaza.
Okay, well, let's put that to the Israeli government spokesman.
And also by
if I could just take it on to Mark REGEV, the Israeli government spokesman. Forgive me for interrupting. We just try and move it on if we can. Mr. REGEV, the suggestion here that innocents were killed, that children died on rooftops at the hands of what is supposed to be a very precise weapon. I imagine it must be of great concern to the Israeli government, yet, as Mr. Barghouti was alluding to, there has been no credible investigation.
I disagree. There have been ongoing investigations by our military. We issued detailed reports a few weeks back, dozens of pages of transcript and so forth. We looked into various allegations. I want to be clear here that Israel in the Gaza campaign, we used state-of-the-art 21st century military technology precisely to be more precise, to be as surgical as is humanly possible in a very difficult combat situation. That's why you use drones, that's why you use satellites, that's why you use other medium equipment, so you can separate the target that you want to hit from the civilians surrounding them. Now, this is specifically difficult, particularly difficult in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas adopted a deliberate policy of embedding itself behind the civilian population, using the civilian population as a human shield.
Mr. REGEV, on March the 12th, Human Rights Watch, as part of their research for this, submitted a list of questions to you related to this specific report. Why was it not possible for the Israeli government to answer a single one of those questions?
Well, first of all, I'd urge everyone to look at our own reports, which are very professional and have been widely analysed and been reviewed. But let's be clear here, there are very serious problems with the methodology that Human Rights Watch is using here. And without wanting to push the point too much, everyone understands, and Human Rights Watch itself has done research on this and reported this, that there's not a democracy there in Gaza. The Hamas regime rules with an iron fist. I think it was Human Rights Watch that reported that Hamas members go around shooting in the kneecaps people who speak out of turn.
Okay, let's put that
and one has to ask yourself, how is it possible
Human Rights Watch? Accusations about your methodology, sir.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the accusation was there. It was a bit unclear. Let me respond quickly to 2 points. The first about the IDF investigations that Mr. REGEV asks us to take seriously. There's really nothing to take seriously there. The IDF, about a month ago or a little more, published the results of 5 independent, separate investigations into its conduct during the CAS-led operation. They were extremely general. They do refer to one drone case, but it's the drone case that your reporter set up in the previous piece about the oxygen canister case, in which the IDF eventually had to fall back admitting that they were not Grad rockets being loaded onto the truck, but oxygen canisters, but then came back with a completely unsubstantiated allegation that 4 of the people loading the Grad rockets, rather oxygen canisters, were Hamas members without giving any information to back that up. That's just sort of, that's actually the best the investigations get that the IDF has conducted, because it actually does talk about a specific case. The rest of the investigations are extraordinarily general, and of course they find that absolutely no wrongdoing occurred. So I think there's very little to take seriously in that case. And by the way, no transcripts were included in those investigations. I'm not sure what Mr. REGEV is referring to when he claims transcripts were released. On the second point about our methodology, again, I'm not really sure what the critique was. What I was left with was the statement that it's not a democracy in Gaza and that Hamas rules with an iron fist. Well, I'm not really sure what the claim is here. If it's not a democracy, that makes it okay to kill civilians, even though you're using an extremely precise weapon that could actually target a Hamas member on one side of the street and leave virtually unscathed civilians on the other side of the street. That's how precise and accurate a weapon the drone-fired missile is. Actually, it has many benefits from a humanitarian human rights point of view, and I would like to emphasize that Human Rights Watch is not against the use of drones. It's against the use of drones the way they were used in the cases we document to kill civilians for no discernible reason.
Let me bring back Mr. REGEV again. It is in your power, actually, to shut everybody up about this. I'm sure you must get heartily fed up of everyone being on Israel's case the whole time, but there is footage that the drones have taken of every single incident that you hold, the Israeli government hold, the Israeli army holds, of each target that was struck. Why can't we just have a look at that footage? Why don't you just show it to the world, and then that'll prove your point and we'll all shut up?
We released many minutes of footage, including cockpits from helicopters and pilots who we showed footage of how, when civilians were spotted, actually missiles were diverted to avoid killing innocent civilians. But if I could,
what about these
take my colleague's point about a specific allegation was made. He said, "What has it got to do with democracy?" It's got everything to do with democracy, sir, because if people live under an iron fist regime, a regime that is brutal, and you yourself, your organization has reported that, when you're going around getting testimony from people, you come in for 2 weeks, you leave. Who is there before, during, and after? Hamas. And Hamas, as you yourself in Human Rights Report has reported, does not take kindly when people speak out against the regime, against the Hamas military, against their operations. And I think this is a fact that has not been taken into account. When people say there were no Hamas fighters in a vicinity, what would happen to someone who would say there were Hamas fighters in a facility? To what extent, and we've seen this unfortunately with the UN investigation, to what extent is Hamas monitoring what you're doing and seeing who you are speaking to? To what extent is this a rare example of a supposed human rights organization working hand in tandem with an authoritarian regime that oppresses the people of Gaza.
So what are you actually saying? Are you saying that the methodology resulted in an incorrect report, that these 6 specific items that have been detailed are actually factually incorrect?
I'm saying they're based on a methodology that is flawed, and therefore the facts presented in the report are very questionable.
Okay,
Once again,
let's
how
bring in
does
Mr.
one
Barghouti.
independently
Mustafa Barghouti,
corroborate data in Gaza?
Mr. Barghouti, Mr. REGEV makes the point that the finger of blame must point at Hamas. It's something that's been said many times, of course, but it's a fair point as well.
May I respond a little bit to some of what was said? First of all, I don't think Israel has the right to investigate, since it is the opponent. So Israel cannot be the opponent and the judge at the same time. Second of all, it is refusing to cooperate with every investigation committee from United Nations. That's why the commission that is headed by Mr. Goldstone today in Gaza has to meet with people like us in Jordan, rather than because Israel is not allowing them even to come to the West Bank. That shows that Israel insists on hiding the reality. Third point, as a medical doctor, I think it's an insult to medicine and the humanity of medicine that Mr. REGEV uses terms like surgical precision. This surgical precision of the Israeli army has taken away the lives of 420 children in Gaza and injured 5,000 more. 1,400 people were killed, including women and children. The majority were civilians. Is that the surgical precision that Israel is talking about? And then he speaks about democracy and lack of democracy. Israel itself is not a democracy. Israel is an apartheid. I don't know what kind of democracy it is that produces a person like Lieberman, who becomes the foreign minister of Israel, and he will be characterized in many countries as a neo-fascist. This is not a real democracy.
Okay, let's get back to the issue in question, Mr. Barghouti. Yeah, I just need to interrupt there for a second, Mr. Barghouti. I just want to emphasize that both Israel and Hamas have been blamed for violating human rights and international humanitarian law during the Gaza conflict. And to investigate the broad sweep of that, the UN set up a fact-finding mission of 4 members headed by Richard Goldstone, which is what you were referring to there, Mr. Barghouti. On Monday, they completed the first round of public hearings in Gaza City, during which they heard testimony from witnesses, victims and experts. The mission wanted to hold hearings in the West Bank and Israel, but that is not possible as the Israeli government has refused to cooperate. And we're going to get a full report on their findings, expected round about August. Mr. Barghouti, what do you hope the UN investigation will achieve?
The truth. And I think it is clear here that Hamas cooperated with this commission. The government in Gaza cooperated with this commission, allowed it to meet people, while Israel is refusing to allow them to come to Israel and refusing to allow them even to come to the West Bank. So the message is very clear here. We trust that Mr. Goldstone and his team hopefully will come up with the most truthful, the most factual report. There were many reports done by other commissions, including a medical international commission that confirmed the situation of the commission of war crimes by Israel, that spoke about the use of illegal weapons like white phosphorus. And I think this commission has enough proofs to come up with facts. All we want is the truth, but we also want the world community to react to this truth. It is unacceptable that Israel is allowed to function as if it is above international law, and this whole feeling of Israel's impunity to international law and to human rights law is unacceptable. I would even go further and say this is going to destroy the future of everybody, including the future of Israelis.
Okay, we're running out of time, gentlemen. We're running out of time, so let me just bring in Mr. REGEV once again. This commission will find only the truth, it will find only the facts. Why can't Israel take part, Mark REGEV?
No, this commission is a problem. Its mandate is so one-sided, you'd have to be blind not to see the problem with the mandate. And the Human Rights Council is so politicized. I think human rights groups themselves have been very critical of the way the Council has just allowed a politicization. I think it was Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that said very severe things about the Council because of their refusal to deal with the problems in South Asia. And of course, they've had nothing to say about the terrible goings-on in Iran over the last few weeks. It's a very political organization. What they're offering us is a kangaroo court. And of course, we won't cooperate with that.
Bill van Esveld, mandate is one-sided. It's a kangaroo court.
Mr. REGEV is completely mischaracterizing the nature of the Goldstone investigation. The original mandate handed down by the Human Rights Council was indeed one-sided. It was biased against Israel because it wasn't going to look at violations by Hamas. We roundly criticized that. But in fact, it's irrelevant at this point because Justice Goldstone, who I might point out is a former member of the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University, he's helped track down Nazi war criminals in Argentina. He, if you think he's a UN patsy, he was a member of the Volcker Oil for Food Commission that implicated the Secretary General of the United Nations' son in corruption. He wrote the terms of his own employment. He wrote the new mandate, and it demands that violations by both Israel and Hamas be investigated. Mr. REGEV's claims are quite outdated and misleading.
Yeah, and Mr. REGEV, it's fair to say that you dismiss the Human Rights Watch report and you dismiss this upcoming UN report. The only report that you're prepared to accept is your own.
Exactly.
Well, I'd just like to say, why is it then that the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, refused to have anything to do with this particular UN investigation? Probably, and she said so publicly, because it was so one-sided and ridiculous. And Mr. Goldstone, no one's saying anything against Goldstone. He is a jurist of international structure. But let's be clear here. Let's be clear here. The report he's writing will go back to the same politicized council that refuses to deal with Iran, that refuses to deal with South Asia, that will only attack Israel, and that's the body that will receive the report. So how does it help these assurances? This is part of a process that unfortunately has done so much harm to the human rights internationally, and that's why your group and Amnesty International have been so critical, as have two Secretary Generals of the United Nations. Both the current Secretary General and the former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, have criticized the Council for giving the human rights mechanism of the United Nations a bad name. And what we're seeing here in this mission is, of course, a further example of that.
Mustafa al-Barghouti, it's giving human rights a bad name.
Listen, Mr. REGEV knows very well that we have been, as Palestinian activists for democracy and human rights, we've been also critical when there were violations on the Palestinian side. And we're not going to hide that. But the fact that there are some human rights violations in Iran does not give Israel the right to go in Gaza and kill people. Gaza is a very small area. It's 240 square miles with 1.5 million people clustered in the highest densely populated area in the world. And they come in with F-16 jet fighters, 60 of them in one attack, throwing missiles everywhere, attacking people with tanks. Israel used a huge military arsenal mainly against civilian population. And thus he cannot find excuse because there is a violation in Azerbaijan about certain human rights as an excuse for Israel to commit these war crimes. He did not respond to this question. Did Israel commit war crimes or not? Disproportionate use of force is a war crime. Killing civilians is a war crime. Preventing medical care to people is a war crime. Killing medical people while they are providing medical care to the injured people is a war crime.
Okay, well, let's put that to Mr. REGEV. Killing civilians, it's fairly blunt. Killing civilians is a war crime. Civilians were killed. It seems that they were killed by high-tech, super high-tech spy drones that had the ability to tell whether or not they were civilians, and yet they were killed. What do you say to that?
Obviously, in the Gaza campaign, innocent civilians were caught up in the crossfire. Unfortunately, that happens in all conflict.
But this wasn't crossfire, sir, was it? This wasn't crossfire. These are specific targets from a spy drone, which has got the most high-tech equipment in the world.
No, I'm answering your question, sir. I'd like a chance to answer, if I could. We make a maximum effort to avoid seeing civilians caught up in the crossfire. But I would argue, sir, if you do an objective report, and you look at NATO's war against Milosevic in Serbia, if you look at NATO actions in Afghanistan, if you look at the war in Iraq, you actually see that Israel, the amount of care we take, if you look at the proportion to innocent people getting caught up in the conflict, it's actually much lower proportionally. We make a maximum effort to target those people, those terrorists who are shooting rockets trying to kill our people. We make a maximum effort to make sure that the uninvolved civilian population stays out of the crossfire. The same can't be said for Hamas, who adopted a deliberate strategy of embedding itself amongst the civilian population, using Gaza's civilians as a human shield, shooting rockets out of schools, out of mosques, planting explosives inside, embedded in civilian housing. This has been documented.
We know
I don't know how people
all
can
a
ignore
matter
it.
of some debate and some conjecture. Unfortunately, time is against us. We'll have to wrap it up there. Mustafa al-barghouti, Mark REGEV, Bill van Esveld, we appreciate your time. That's it. Thanks so much for watching this edition of Inside Story. Don't forget, email any thoughts and comments about our coverage, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, it's goodbye.